Hey, how's it going? I'm going to be uploading a different kind of video from my previous two videos. A little bit more informative, a little bit more of like a talking hands kind of video, I guess you could say. So if you want to, minimize it and just kind of listen, you could do that. That's fine. I'm doing this for two reasons. One, I want to test the waters and see if this is the type of video that people might be interested in. And two, I am still in the process of recording and editing the follow-up video to the self-hosted Proxmox video that I made previously. It's a little longer than the previous two videos that I've made. It's going over installing pfSense in various ways, either virtualization or bare metal, as well as installing a VPN, either OpenVPN or WireGuard, so that you can gain access to your future services that I'm going to be going over how to install in later videos. But either way, I hope you enjoy. Should you install Linux? Chances are, if you're asking yourself that question, I'm pretty sure you probably already know the answer to it. Probably have frustrations with Windows. You may not like where Windows is going, and you're just kind of dealing with it. If that's the case, hey, look, I was there a few years ago. I haven't been using Linux for tens of years. It's only been a few years, and I hated Windows 10. I didn't like Windows 10 at all. I felt like I had no control over my system. My system would tell me I needed administrative privileges when I already had them. It would just force updates even when I didn't want them. And even then, when it would try to install them, it would fail, and it would just go into a boot loop over and over and over. These are the kinds of things that just pushed me over the edge. Screw it, I'm leaving, I'm done with Windows, I don't care anymore. Now, Linux may not necessarily be for everybody, depending on your use case. I think nowadays, the average person can definitely jump on Linux and be fine for the most part. If you're on Windows and you need things like Adobe Photoshop or Premiere or Microsoft Office, if you need those exact pieces of software or Fusion 360 and you cannot give those up, then you might want to just stay on. If there's certain games, for example Fortnite or Apex Legends, those kinds of games, then yeah, you might want to stick to Windows. Aside from that, give Linux a shot, because let me tell you, it ain't that bad. Now, some people might tell you to dual boot, dual boot, that way you can have Linux and then you can also have Windows for the things that you need Windows for. Don't do it. It's more of a headache, and honestly, I feel like it gets more trouble than it's worth. The other thing with doing it that way is that you will create enough friction to not want to stick to Linux, and it's just inconvenient having to restart and reboot your computer into a different operating system. It's honestly really annoying. It's not worth it, in my opinion. All or nothing, at least when you're installing the operating system, either go to Linux or stay on Windows, one or the other. I think an alternative to that, if you need certain things from Windows, is you can run it on a virtual machine. I'm running my Windows off of a virtual machine. If I need something like some sort of software for my keyboard or my mouse or my headset, I can run it off this virtual machine, and I can even have those devices connect to the virtual machine so that I can either update the firmware or update settings through Windows itself without actually having to have Windows. That's also another option. Anyway, that's enough of me babbling about whether you should or shouldn't. If you haven't figured it out, the answer is yes, you should try Linux. And I say try because you can definitely do that. In this previous video that I made, I showed you all how to make a bootable USB drive. What you could do is, for example, we'll start off with this, Linux Mint. If you're not very tech savvy, if you prefer graphical user interface, then Linux Mint is probably going to be your jam. Go to download. There's installation instructions here too, although it's not that hard to figure out, to be honest. More than likely, you're probably going to want to go for Cinnamon. Cinnamon is a nice, modern, very Windows-esque kind of GUI or desktop environment. And desktop environment, all a desktop environment is a specific collection of software, like whatever is going to show your windows, whatever is going to be your start menu, or like all of those kinds of things. There's Cinnamon, there's XFCE, there's Mate or Mate or whatever the hell you pronounce that. This one's kind of based off of GNOME or GNOME. They got weird pronunciations for stuff in Linux. Personally, I would either go with Cinnamon or XFCE. I'm not a big fan of GNOME, but I mean, some people like it, whatever. The point is, you got options, and having more options is always a nice thing. Yes, it could be a little overwhelming, but you know what? The more options, the better, because that means chances are there's going to be something for you. Cinnamon is very Windows-esque. If you want something that feels familiar, go with Cinnamon. If you're installing this on something with a lot older hardware, if you're installing this on like a potato or a toaster of a computer, go with XFCE. As it is, Linux is way less resource hungry compared to Windows, so anything you put Linux on that had Windows in it previously is probably going to run way better anyway. After you go ahead and download it, put it on the USB drive, like I showed you in the previous video how to set up a bootable drive using Ventoy. My recommendation, download the ISOs of all the Linux distros that interest you, put those ISOs on your Ventoy drive, and test them all out. Alright, so here's one. Here's probably my first recommendation. I'm going to have 2 recommendations for those that are not very tech savvy, and then two recommendations for those that are a little bit more familiar with kind of maneuvering, you know, computers and figuring things out and tinkering. So Linux Mint is one of them, alright? Very beginner friendly, very GUI based. The next one that I want to show you is this one, Fedora. Fedora is another one that's really nice, very modern, up to date, very secure. Here you go, Fedora KDE Plasma. So KDE Plasma, what that is a desktop environment. Like I mentioned, a desktop environment is like a combination of different software that kind of creates a whole package for your desktop experience. Same thing with this one. You go to download. More than likely, most desktop systems, this is what you're going to go for, x86 or 64-bit systems. Then there's other ones. You don't have to worry about these. These are for different processor or CPU architecture. So for example, like if you want to install it on like a Raspberry Pi, I think Raspberry Pi is used ARM-based architecture, you can do it through that. That's one of them, Fedora. Linux Mint or Fedora, if you're a beginner and you're not super comfortable with getting your hands dirty and tinkering when it comes to computers, you can use either one of them. I would probably say, I mean, honestly, you can't go wrong with either one of these. I've never personally used Fedora, so I'm not 100% certain if there's like a GUI for their package manager or their packages programs, but you could try it out. Like I said, you could always test it out. You don't have to install the first one you come across. You just pick it in on Ventoy in the menu, and you just choose which one you want to try out and give it a shot. See how it feels, see how it runs, make sure your hardware is recognized, you know, all that kind of stuff. Next up is Arch. This one is infamous for the meme. The thing with Arch though, and yeah, I get it. Everybody knows a meme. I use Arch by the way, whatever. But the thing with Arch that's nice is that imagine buying a phone that doesn't come pre-installed with Gmail, doesn't come pre-installed with, you know, Candy Crush or any of that other stuff. It is just a baseline system. Arch is really nice because what it does is it gives you a foundation for you to build on. It's only gonna have what you want, use, and need. Now, that being said, that also means you have to know what you want, use, and need. If you're coming from Windows and you're moving to Linux, you have to go with the mentality of, oh, will this run on Linux? No, you gotta throw away that mentality rather. You will have to go with the mentality of what alternative does Linux have, right? So for example, there is no Windows 365 or Windows or Microsoft Office, I mean, that doesn't exist here. However, there is OpenOffice, LibreOffice, and both of those can save to file types that are compatible with Microsoft Office. So there is no Premiere on this, there is no Photoshop, but you know what there is? I don't need Photoshop, I got GIMP, alright? GNU image manipulation program. This works more or less the same way. I don't have Adobe Premiere, what I have is Kdenlive. So the point is, a lot of people are trying to stay with the programs that they know, and some of them can work on Linux. Some of them either have Linux versions, like native versions, or you can use something called Wine. And what Wine does is it allows you to run certain Windows programs within Linux. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that those programs are going to work 100%. Not every program is going to work either. Just keep that in mind. But anyway, Arch is really nice because it is a base foundation for your operating system, and you add to it the things that you need. So it's very, very simple in that regard. Now, the thing with Arch, and why I might not necessarily recommend it for a beginner, is that you are going to have to use the terminal for things like the package manager and downloading programs, which isn't really that big of a deal. But I know some people are absolutely terrified. They don't want to type stuff. They just want to click. They want to see icons. They want to see buttons. They want to click on those things, right? So I get it. That's fine. That's what Linux Mint is for. That's what Fedora is for. If you don't have an aversion to typing things out in the terminal, then definitely give Arch a try. Now, my personal preference is actually a derivative of Arch, and that's called Artix. Just like Arch is a very minimalistic system. Honestly, the only major difference with Artix and Arch is that Artix does not have systemd. I'm not going to get into all of that stuff. This is a personal preference. This is a personal choice, but this is also very easy to install too. You can give this a shot. Installing Artix is a lot easier than installing Arch, unless you use the Arch install script, but even then, that Artix is still easy. If you like the whole concept of Arch, but want something that's a little bit easier, you could always try out other derivatives, you know, like Manjaro. I would personally go for Artix over Manjaro, but again, that's me. That's my personal preference. Now, one really nice thing about Arch and its derivatives is this right here, called the AUR, alright? And the AUR is a community-driven database of packages that people, you know, package and put up so that everybody else can use it as well. Chances are, you're more than likely going to find a lot more software support and a lot more things that you could run on Arch as opposed to some other system. Now, what's another one? Oh, and then lastly, Void. Void is another Linux distribution, but the thing with Void that's interesting about it is that it's not a derivative. It is its own distribution. distribution. So for example, Linux Mint is a derivative. In other words, it's derived from Debian, which is also another option. Debian's also a really nice one too. Now, why would I recommend Linux Mint over Debian? Well, mainly because Linux Mint is, again, much more beginner friendly. Debian, the focus on Debian is not beginner friendliness, but the focus of Debian is stability. Debian is probably one of the oldest, most supported operating systems out there for Linux, and security and stability is its main focus. This is derived off of Debian. So you get the benefits of that stability and security, but with the added benefit of having a beginner distribution, something very beginner friendly, something very familiar to those that are coming from Windows. Well, either way, I hope I was able to help you out. Now, these aren't the only distros. There's tons and tons of distributions out there. These are just 4 out of like that, I don't know, hundreds of different distros that are out there. The more popular a distro is, chances are the easier it's going to be for you to find answers and support for things. That doesn't mean that newer distributions are not worth trying out, but as like a daily driver, as like something that stays on your system and you're stuck with for a long period of time, I don't know. I don't think it's something you really got to consider and think about. Well, either way, I hope I was able to help you out. Have a good one.